The Ptolemies married their sisters, their brothers, their daughters, their sons, their stepdaughters, stepsons, cousins, aunts, uncles. Oh man, it was a mess. Today is a big day. We are going to maybe make it through the Ptolemies today. Oh man, I dread the Ptolemies. Man, they are a mess. You all are going to miss the simple days of simple family trees of Philip II and Alexander the Great. Oh, those are the days, my friend. We thought they'd never end. The Ptolemies married their sisters, their brothers, their daughters, their sons, their stepdaughters, stepsons, cousins, aunts, uncles. Oh man, it was a mess. You should see the family tree. Well, I'm going to show you the family tree here in just a minute when we get started with the Ptolemies today. Okay? But first, before we start on the Ptolemies, let's wrap up chapter 3. Chapter 3 is about Alexander the Great and the Diadochi. Remember, we talked about the Diadochi were the successors of Alexander the Great. Okay? We talked about four main Diadochi: Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus, the four horns of chapter 8. We'll touch on that here in just a minute. Let me go ahead and go through the animation one more time of the Diadochi. We did it at the very end of last week's class. I spent a lot of time with these animations, so I want to get the most miles for the buck as I can out of these. So, this is what the world looked like when Alexander the Great died. Macedon, or the Greek kingdom, had taken over pretty much the entire world at that point. All the way over here to the subcontinent of India, past the Indus River, all the way up here to the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, all the way over the entire lower peninsula of the Balkan Peninsula, and all of Egypt. Pretty amazing thing that he did. But by the time he died, and I picked just a kind of a random year, 295 BC, his entire kingdom had blown apart into a bunch of different pieces. We'll see that as we animate this here in just a minute. Notice, first of all, on the right-hand side, we see his kingdom over here immediately collapses back past this Indus River right here. So these Indian kings kind of took back over some of their territory, and things stayed kind of normal for a while, very calm, until 304 BC, boom! What happened was, all of Alexander's successors had died. All of his bloodline had died. And I'm going to show you that in just a minute, how they were killed, how they were snuffed out. And by the time that happened, just a few years later, I don't remember who it was now, but one of the Diadochi declared themselves to be king. And immediately, every one of them declared to be king. And that's why you see in that animation up there, boom, 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 boom. Seleucid claimed himself to be king. Ptolemy claimed to be king. Antigonus up here in Asia Minor declared himself to be king. So that's why you see that all of a sudden, boom, of all these kingdoms just split apart. His entire kingdom split apart into the various kingdoms of the Diadochi. Now, during this time, there were three sets of wars that were going on. We're not going to cover the first set of wars, the Diadochi Wars. They were very, very complex. I've got a pretty big library of intertestament books, history books, and I only have just one book dedicated to the Diadochi. There's not a lot of information out there. I've got some other books that are general references to the Diadochi, kind of like what I'm going to show you today. But it's a pretty complex subject about how they fought wars and did this, and they took... In fact, some of my literature is very simplistic, that Palestine was controlled by the Ptolemies for this period of time. Well, it wasn't really. If you break it up into little details, it was controlled by Antigonus here, and the Ptolemies here, and the Seleucids here, and for just a really short period of time, and then the Ptolemies for a little longer time. It was kind of a mess, okay? So we're not going to talk about the Diadochi Wars. There were 6 Syrian Wars. In the book, I call them Syriolemic Wars, the Syrians and the Ptolemies. And I call them that to distinguish that they were between the Syrians and the Egyptians, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Okay, 6 wars. I'm going to cover those very briefly today because it's really hard in teaching this in what order to teach things. Because right now we've got 2 major kingdoms we're interested in. We've got the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Syrians in Syria, the Seleucids in Syria, and Palestine in the middle. Okay. So how do you talk about wars that are between these people and these people fighting in the middle in Palestine? Well, you can talk about it one or two places or both. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you very briefly to the Syrian Wars, okay? But generally, they were more applicable to the Seleucids, the other side of the war, the other side of the fighting, okay? So we're going to hold off most of that discussion until next week, or the week after, whenever we happen to get to it. The main one, the Fifth Syrian War, main one, they all were kind of interesting. They all had their interesting points. But for our cases today, the main one was the Fifth Syrian War when Coele-Syria went from control under the Ptolemies to control under the Seleucids, okay? So 3, 4, 5, and 6 are very interesting wars. Again, we'll cover those very quickly. The third set of wars are civil wars. We had brothers fighting against sisters. Well, more specifically, brothers fighting against sister/wife and fighting against their stepdaughter/wife/niece. Ha! You don't believe me, do you? I'm going to show you a family tree here in just a minute of how these people intermarried amongst each other. Oh man, it's really complicated, which is kind of cool. It's kind of cool to figure out all this stuff and what they did. All right, so the Diadochis were having their wars, but a main good point in time to put a stake is 311 BC, when they had a peace treaty. And this is what the region looked like. Now, the four horns of Daniel 8 are Seleucus. He controlled Syria, and he controlled way over here, all this. Well, I'm going to show you a chart in just a minute of how much region he controlled off to the right of this map. Antigonus, he was not one of the horns. Ptolemy was one of the horns. Lysimachus was one of the horns. Cassander, one of the horns. I wish Daniel, when he did his prophecy, had said 5 horns. That would have been real easy. Antigonus, I think, would have been probably the 5th horn if he had done that. But this is the peace treaty. These are the areas that controlled. So Antigonus controlled Palestine first. Ptolemy controlled all of Memphis, all the way over to about where the Carthaginian kingdom happened. And Seleucus, all this up in here, Syria, Asia. Antigonus controlled Asia Minor and Palestine. Cassander, Lysimachus controlled Thrace, Greece, up in that area. Okay. And this is Seleucus' area. So you can see the very corner of Antigonus right here, and this giant area that Seleucus controlled. Notice he does not control past the Indus River anymore. These Indian kings over here had taken this area back by the time Seleucus came along. All right. So last week we looked at the family tree of Philip II. He was the father of Alexander the Great. Okay? He died in 336 BC, but this is his family. His fourth wife was Olympias, and Olympias had the son, Alexander the Great. Okay? Well, after Philip died, she really wanted Alexander the Great to be king. Well, how do you do that? Back in those days, you had to kill people. You know, you just have to do what you have to do. You had to kill people. Well, she decided, first of all, let's kill Philip's current wife, his widow, wife number 7. Let's kill Cleopatra, Euergetes, and their son, Caranus. He could have been the next king after Alexander the Great, because he was like, just a normal kid. He was very young when he was killed. Philip Arrhidaeus, remember, he was, we don't know, mentally unfit or epilepsy or something. Alexander the IV was a very young person at this time, and also happens to be her grandson. So she didn't want to kill him, right away at least. But she did almost immediately. After Philip died in 336, the next year she killed Philip's last wife, his widow, and their son. Now, she didn't just kill them, strangle them in the middle of the night or something like that. She was kind of brutal. She actually took them and dragged them onto a cauldron, a bronze cauldron filled with fire. So it was not a good death for these two people. She was not a nice person. Okay? When Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, we see that she killed Philip Arrhidaeus. About, 6 years later or so. Okay? The mentally unfit half-brother of Alexander the Great. Well, it's looking pretty good. The tree trimming's going pretty good for Olympias. Okay? So she's got it down to just 2 people, or Alexander IV, I guess, at this point. But Cassander comes along, one of the Diadochi. Now, Cassander, his philosophy was, I don't care anything about Alexander the Great. Remember I told you there was 2 philosophies of these Diadochi? One was, let's let the bloodline of Alexander the Great continue. Let's let Philip Arrhidaeus rule. Let's let Alexander IV rule. Let's let the bloodline of Alexander continue. Okay? Ptolemy, he was kind of along that line. Ptolemy went off to Egypt and parked himself. He said, okay, I'm happy as a governor here in Egypt. I'll just park here and let the things, I mean, he participated in the Diadochi Wars, but he kind of just let things go. He was parked in Egypt. He said, I'm taking Egypt. I don't care. Cassander was different. He said, I don't care about the bloodline of Alexander the Great. I'm going to be the next Alexander the Great, whatever it takes. And he, killed Olympias in 316 BC. She had it coming. She was not really a nice person, the fourth wife of Philip. He then killed Roxana, Alexander's wife, first wife, in 309 BC, and their son, Alexander IV. The tree is now completely trimmed. No more bloodline successors to Alexander the Great. And what do? Well, you move on and you have your individual kingdoms like we saw in the animation where everything split apart around 305, 304 BC. Okay, so now wrapping up the Greek kingdom, let's go back and just study the history of Greece. And a lot of times in your Western Civ classes, you'll go through the Greek history. You know, this is kind of like the heritage of where we came from. Okay? So back in the year 3000 BC or so was the beginning of the Minoan period. In 1450 BC, you know these dates are approximate, of course. About the 1450 BC, the destruction of Minoans by maybe a volcano, we don't know, and then the Mycenaean period. From 1600 to 1100, the sack of Troy in 1250. Some of the Homer's works, a lot of legend there, but there was some historical fact in the sack of Troy. The Greek Dark Ages from 1100 to 750 BC. We don't know much what happened during that time. 750 BC, the first polis. Okay, started rising up around Greece. We talked about that last week. Okay, the Greeks colonized the entire Aegean Sea between 750 and 500. We have the wars between Sparta and the Messenians. The reason Sparta, there are movies about Sparta, how militaristic they were. Okay. And the reason they were is because they conquered the Messenians in 725, two different wars, 725 to 710 and 650 to 625. And they took these people as slaves. And it turns out these helots, they were called, I believe, as their slaves, they really outnumbered the Spartans. So the Spartans really, really, really emphasized military training. Their young kids from, I think, 8 years old, they were forced to go into basic military training. The Spartans are who did the Battle of Thermopylae. Remember Leonidas? There's some cool new movies on that. The 300. They held the pass of Thermopylae against this giant Persian army back in whatever time it was, back in 480 BC. The Peloponnesian Wars were between Sparta and Athens. Sparta on the very southern tip of the Balkan Peninsula, and Athens to the north of them. They were always fighting each other in the Peloponnesian War. There's a minor Peloponnesian War and a major Peloponnesian War, the Great Peloponnesian War. Okay, that's in the 400s BC. Let's step along in history now. Athens and Sparta started fighting. Athens was surrendered to Sparta in 404 BC. Sparta then seized Thebes. That's hard to say. And then Sparta defeated by Thebes. And then comes along where we pick up with the reign of Philip II of Macedon. And he takes the entire peninsula, lower part of the peninsula, the Balkan Peninsula, before he dies in 336 BC. Then Alexander the Great comes along. We know what he did. We've seen that several times already. He had several major battles against the Persians, Granicus River, Issus, Guatemala, Persepolis. And then in Babylon, he died in 323 BC at the age of 32 years old. And then his kingdom blew apart, as we saw in the animation. All right. So that wraps up chapter 3. Whew. Y'all worn out like I am? And we haven't even started the Ptolemies. Oh, we have so much mess to cover under the Ptolemies. So, the Ptolemies, starting Ptolemy, his brother Ptolemy, and his other brother Ptolemy. In the intro of chapter 4 of my book, anybody ever watch Newhart? Yeah, some of you did. Back in the day, yeah. All you old folks watch Newhart. I'm an old folk. One of my favorite parts was Larry and his brothers would come over from the whatever they did next door. They came over to Bob Newhart's inn, and every single time the main guy would say, "Hi, I'm Larry. This is my brother Daryl, and this is my other brother Daryl." Remember that? Every time. And neither one of the Daryls ever spoke until the last episode. I think they finally spoke. But that was one of my favorite shows. But this is real. Oh, and his wife and sister Cleopatra. Oh, and his stepdaughter, wife, niece. Cleopatra. Turns out that one of the guys, Ptolemy I, married his sister, Cleopatra. They had a daughter, or she had a son, I'm sorry, that he killed her. He also had a daughter, and he married the daughter. Anyway, I'll show you that in just a minute on the family tree. It was a mess. All right, let's move on. All right, so we talked about the dreams. We keep going back to this chart. The Old Testament with Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, when they took the Israelites away, the Persians came along, the Medo-Persian Empire, the ram with two horns came and let the Jews go back to their land in Palestine, Coele-Syria. And then we have the goat with one horn, the goat being the kingdom of Macedon, or the Greek kingdom, with a great horn, Alexander the Great, the four horns, the Diadochi, Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, Seleucid, and then the little horn we'll talk about starting next week, I hope, if everything goes well. This is the text. We see the ram, the Medo-Persian Empire. The male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, and he just basically savaged the ram. So the Greek Empire just completely destroyed the Persian Empire. And this male goat grew exceedingly great until the great horn, Alexander the Great, died. And then we see the four prominent horns, as I mentioned, the four horns there. These are the Diadochi. And not all the Diadochi. I think there was 18 or so. I mentioned 10 last week. But these are the ones we're most interested in. Cassander, he was the one that was outwardly hostile to Alexander's memory. He murdered, as we saw, Alexander the Great's mother and some other people. He opposed Polyperchon. We didn't get into that history. Lysimachus was one of Alexander's bodyguards. He established the Attalid dynasty, named after the first ruler from 241 to 197 BC. What we're going to talk about today is Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander's generals who became ruler of Egypt and established the Ptolemaic dynasty. Next week, we'll talk about the Seleucid dynasty established by Seleucus I Nicator. Okay. Now, if you haven't figured it out by now, we keep going back to this chart every single week, right? If you have the book, this will be a good chart for you to go back and study. It has a lot of information on it. It has the dreams on it. It has the line of succession. Now, remember, for this chart, this is just looking at Palestine, just looking at Coele-Syria. These are the leaders of Coele-Syria, okay? So we're kind of stepping back and looking more at the Ptolemies in full. Next week, we'll look at the Seleucids in full. But these were the rulers of Coele-Syria. We had 5 Ptolemaic kings over Syria after Alexander the Great died. So that's the area we're going to look at, just the people in blue today. All right? This is a blow-up of that area. Alexander the Great died in 323 BC. Ptolemy I Soter takes over, and through his progeny, he rules until in 198 BC, Antiochus III the Great takes over. The father of, by the way, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We've talked about him already, right? We're going to talk about him next week, big time. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, okay? The Seleucids take control in 198 BC during the 5th Syrian War. We'll talk about the Syrian Wars next week as well. Now, when we talk about the Ptolemies, I threw this chart in the book kind of for fun because I didn't really understand how it all worked. This is a relationship of cousins, a primer on cousins, okay? So if you don't know who your cousin is, you basically share a G. You share a grandfather. So my father's brother's son or daughter is my cousin because my father, his father, was the father of both sons, right? So I'm first cousins to my uncle's son. That's first cousin. If my uncle's son had a son or daughter, then they would be a first cousin once removed. You always take the quickest way you can get back to your grandfather, and then however generations you go down, if you had a son, a grandson, whatever, there'd be a first cousin once removed, first cousin twice removed, first cousin thrice removed, or whatever, okay? Second cousins, you trace back to 2 G's. Your great-grandfather, great-grandfather, okay? Those are second cousins. Now, we see, the reason I just threw this in there for fun in the book was because we see, cousins is one thing marrying, but marrying your sisters and brothers, that's quite another thing. Now, the good old days of simple charts are over. This one is not simple. Now, in my defense, there aren't many charts out there in the literature. Putting this chart together was really, really hard. Really, really, really hard. Trying to figure out who was married to who and who had each other's daughter married and whatever. So let me see if I can step through some of this. We've already talked about some of this last time. Marriage numbers, and I know you can't see this. I'm going to blow this up in a minute so you can see it better. Marriage numbers are the small numbers beside here. Dotted lines are marriages with the marriage numbers, okay? Children are solid lines. Ovals are women. Rectangles are men. Blue boxes are Ptolemaic rulers. They're not all named Ptolemy. We had Ptolemies, we had Cleopatras, we had Arsenos, we had a bunch of different names, but the Ptolemies are what you think of when you think of the Ptolemaic or the Egyptian kingdom, okay? The red dotted boxes, it's really hard to see, but here's some over here. These are red dotted boxes. These are outsiders. These particular outsiders were of the Seleucid kingdom. So Cleopatra Thea married 3 different people at different times in the Seleucid kingdom. If you have trouble with this, I have a table in there on page 98 to 100 that has detailed information to go with this chart. This is hard to follow. The table will help. I also outline this not in a family tree, but in a timeline that I'll show you in just a minute. Okay? Ptolemy I Soter, right up here, started it all. His name, his progeny, was the name of the Ptolemaic kingdom, down through Cleopatra the 7th. Everybody heard of her? You might not know who she is, but Cleopatra the 7th was the Cleopatra. She was the gal that hooked up with Julius Caesar. She's the gal that hooked up with Mark Antony. She was the gal that ultimately brought down the Ptolemaic Empire through Octavian. We're going to cover that in mere moments, I hope, if we get to that. All right. So, notice some connections. Purple connections, these blue or purple circles, are external influences in the kingdom. Ptolemy I married Euergetes. Okay, she was the daughter of Antigonus. Ptolemy II married Arsinoe I of Greece. She was the daughter of Lysimachus. Remember, these names are the Diadochi, which makes sense because Ptolemy was the Diadochi. It would make sense that they would intermarry with their friend generals' daughters and whatever. Okay. We see some influence between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids in red. For example, Berenike. Now, I've seen this pronounced different ways. Bernice is how we pronounce it in English. Berenike is a pronunciation that I've seen, so I'll probably say it 18 different ways. But Berenike, over here was married to, even though she was a daughter of one of the Ptolemies, she was married to Antiochus II Theos, one of the Seleucids. Same thing as I mentioned with Cleopatra Thea. She had these 3 husbands that were Seleucids. Same thing over here with Tryphena, Cleopatra V Selene. Okay, so we see lots of interactions between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, family tree-wise. We'll see a lot of interactions war-wise. Oh boy, the biggest wars you can have are family, right? Particularly when you marry your wife's daughter and cut up her son in pieces. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll get to that in just a minute. Next up, green circles. Julius Caesar of the Roman Empire, or Roman Republic. Mark Antony of the Roman Republic. They were married, well, Mark Antony was married to her, and then Cleopatra had her dalliance with Julius Caesar, and she was the reason the Ptolemaic Empire fell in 30 BC. All right, now, I know you can't see any of that. Let's blow it up. And a good blow-up line is between Cleopatra here. So we're going to blow up this top part of the chart so you can see it a little better, and then later on, we'll blow up the bottom part of the chart. So Cleopatra's a very nice delineation line. This is the top part of the chart. Ptolemy I started all off. He was a Greek general that started off the Ptolemaic Empire. The Ptolemies were Greeks, even though they ruled Egypt. I mean, that's kind of interesting. So Ptolemy really here could be in a dotted red. I think if I redo the book if I do a second edition of the book, I'll probably put Ptolemy in a red dotted line to show that he really was not Egyptian. Okay? Ptolemy II started the practice of marrying his sister. We see Ptolemy II, his second wife, married Arsinoe II. That was her 3rd marriage. Okay? Don't know why he started that, but he did. And the rest of the Ptolemies kind of went along with that idea. Ptolemy IV married his sister Arsinoe. See a solid line here, solid line here. brother, sister. Only one marriage, so I don't have a one or a one there. There's only one marriage if it's obvious how many times they married. Cleopatra too married two of her brothers. First of all, Ptolemy VI, see the line, solid line, her brother. That was her first marriage. Her second marriage was Ptolemy VIII. Oh man, that was a bad move, marrying Ptolemy VIII. Okay. Ptolemy VIII married his stepdaughter and niece, Cleopatra III. He first married his sister. Notice the solid lines coming down from Cleopatra I. He married his sister, marriage line, children lines, and then later he married his wife's daughter. Turns out that was his stepdaughter, his niece, and stepdaughter and niece. Well, that's not going to end well. I can tell you that right now. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Cleopatra ties the top to the bottom, and here we are at the bottom part of the tree with Cleopatra tying it all together. More brother-sister marriages, Ptolemy 9, 12, 13, 14. 13 and 14, by the way, were married to Cleopatra, our famous Cleopatra. The one historians love to write about Cleopatra, right, because of her interactions with the Roman Empire. Historians love that. Well, she was, first of all, married to Ptolemy XIII, her brother, and Ptolemy XIV, her brother. It didn't end well for Ptolemy XIII. Didn't end well for Ptolemy XIV. She married, or had this affair with Julius Caesar. They had a son, Ptolemy XV, Caesarion. She wanted him to be king of the Roman Empire. No, it's not going to work out for her. I'm telling you that up front. Just stay tuned for that. Next up, the very last of the Ptolemies. Well, Cleopatra was, for all practical purposes, the last of the Ptolemies when Octavian had her kid. Well, actually, she committed suicide, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But when she committed suicide, she was practically the end of the Ptolemies. But just to make sure, this person right down here, the grandson of Cleopatra VII, was killed by the Roman Emperor Caligula in 40 AD. All right, so that's the family tree. Now let's look at it from a different timeline, or a different point of view, the timeline view. All right? This is the timeline of the Ptolemies. What a mess. It doesn't get any better. You know, we think things might get simpler, but it doesn't. Okay? I know you can't see this, but I want you to look at some of the generalities of what I'm trying to show. If you have a blue bar, that is a sole ruler. So, Ptolemy I, he's listed out to the side of the blue bar. He was satrap or governor for several years until 304, when they all declared, I want to be king now. Until then, he became a king, and he ruled as a sole ruler for that number of years. He then ruled, these green bars that overlap each other. If you go down to the key, he ruled in harmony with a ruler in green. So he ruled in harmony with his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Then he ruled, Ptolemy II then ruled after his father died as a sole ruler until he ruled with his son, the son. Now, think about the Ptolemies. If you go to the literature, they're numbered 1, 2, a little bit down to 15. There are a whole bunch of other rulers besides the 15 that are named in the literature. There's Ptolemy the son, there's a bunch of Cleopatras, there's Arsinoes, whatever. Okay? The way I keep up with that in my writing is to actually number these things as 2A. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it's number 2A. So Ptolemy II is number 2, right there. Ptolemy the son, since he doesn't show up in the literature as one of the numbered Ptolemies, I show him as 2A to keep up with things as I go through the text. All right. What else do we need to see about this? The pink at the top is the timeline of when Palestine, or Coele-Syria, was controlled by the Ptolemies. So this little pink is a little bit of a misnomer here because it was a really unstable time. I might work on that next time I do the chart. This area here, and this is a little different than in the book too, by the way. I have pink all the way across. But this time was controlled by Antigonus. This time was mostly controlled by the Ptolemies. Again, if I could blow that up into a bigger timeline, you'd see there's periods of Seleucid control for, they have a Seleucid War, and they control Palestine for a little bit, and then Ptolemies would take it back. So it's really hard to capture all the detail in this kind of chart. I have the Syrian Wars on here. I didn't know this till I was preparing for this class, but the Syrian Wars line up, except for number 1, they line up with the Ptolemies. The first Syrian War was, if I look at the timeline line up, it was with Ptolemy II. The second Syrian War was lined up with Ptolemy II. I know that didn't make sense. The Third Syrian Wars lined up with Ptolemy III. This is good. I love these little memory things. I can keep up with stuff. The Third Syrian War was Ptolemy III. The Fourth Syrian War was Ptolemy IV. The Fifth Syrian War, Ptolemy V. The Sixth Syrian War, Ptolemy VI. That's pretty cool, except for the first one was Ptolemy II. So now I can keep up with those as I do these presentations from now on. And then, yeah, okay, the Sixth Syrian Wars lined up with the Ptolemies, except for number one. That's kind of cool. I didn't realize that until I was doing this. So, note events. These little triangles here. This is the day of Eleusis. We'll talk about that in just a second as well. Very important day that happened. We know that Onias came to Egypt and rebuilt the temple there. Okay? Down here we see Octavian annexed Egypt in 30 BC. Now I actually have two timelines on here. I put all the Ptolemies on one chart. These top Ptolemies above this hard line here go by this top timeline. All the bottom Ptolemies here go on the bottom timeline. Okay? Just to save paper in the book for whatever reason. Okay. Let's make sure I cover everything. Yep, I think I covered everything I want to talk about on that book, on that chart. Now, I also have on that chart time slices. Let me go back to that. Hard to see again. Right there, that S, that says S1. That is a time slice. This blue area is time slice 1. This white area is time slice 2, very tiny time slice. So we go from blue, white, all the way up to 44, I think, time slice. Yeah, 44 time slices, which turns out to be a wide area. Okay. What I did is also have a table in the book that goes and describes each one of these time slices. So some of these are really easy to see. Time slice 1 is really easy to see. Ptolemy I Soter was the main guy. He was it. We have more complex time slices like time slice number 22. Let's look at that. I can't even hardly see it up here, and I'm standing right in front of it. This is time slice 22. It's a white time slice, and we see that Ptolemy VIII ruled with Cleopatra III, his wife's daughter, and they ruled against Cleopatra II, his wife's sister. Not wife's sister, but his wife/sister. Okay? So these two ruled together. So we ruled with harmony with rulers in red, and in opposition to a ruler in green. So these three rulers ruled at the time. A little bit harder to see. If you go to the table, it'll tell you, okay, well, this is how they ruled. And I have a little bit of a blurb over here about how they ruled and how they got along and that kind of thing. Some slices are very narrow, very difficult to see. Let's look at slice number 13. Right here. It's a really, really tiny sliver of a blue line. If you have the book, it's really advantageous to go to page 122 and look at this. It's a tiny little sliver, slice 13, and I can't tell from here, and it's really even hard to tell in the book, but there's a little green sliver there, and a green there, and green there. So it turns out if you go to the table, if you can't see it in the chart, we'll see that, yeah, slice 13, these three people ruled together during the Sixth Syrian War. Okay? All right, so that's just there's no way I can cover all the intricacies and the fighting and everything that's going on in the Ptolemies. It's a very complex piece of history, but I just want to kind of give you the overall feel. So there are three periods during the history of the Ptolemies. The first was the Golden Age, when Ptolemy I started things out, and everything was kind of good through the death of Ptolemy III, Euergetes. Egypt had won much of the territory during the Third or Syriolemic War, Third Syrian War, and rulers were interested in the state of the state as opposed to the state of themselves. Wow, what a concept. So when they are interested in the state of the state, the kingdom tends to do pretty well, right? If they're not interested in enriching themselves. Well, that started to change during the age of decline and transition from 222 to 168. Ptolemy IV started that out until the day of Eleusis. We'll talk about that again in just a minute, during the Sixth Syrian War. Even though the Ptolemies won the war, the Sixth Syrian War, it set them up to be dependent on Rome, as we'll see, and they finally succumbed to Rome in 30 BC with Cleopatra VII. Okay? Much of Egypt's decline was due to the strengthening of the Seleucids and the Romans. And then the last period of Ptolemaic history is Roman influence and authority over Egypt. The day of Eleusis set up once and for all who the undisputed champion of the world was: Rome. And Egypt was just kind of along for the ride at that point until Cleopatra really kind of messed things up and Octavian decided to declare a war on her. Not a good thing if you're a kingdom and Rome decides to declare a war on you. That happened to her in 30. And then Rome takes over Egypt. All right, so let's step through some of this. The first kings, Ptolemy I Soter, he was the only Ptolemy to die from natural causes. That tells you something about the kingdom. A little bit of a turmoil there, okay? He was harsh to the Jews at first, and he was kind. He settled about 100,000 of them in Alexandria in Egypt. He was satrap at first, from 323 to 305, and then he was king. He perhaps founded the Alexandria Library. It might have been his son, Ptolemy II. He was also the sponsor of the mathematician Euclid. Anybody know Euclid? If you've taken any kind of geometry in high school or college or whatever, you're familiar with Euclid. Oh, what? I'm sorry. It's Ptolemy's fault that you have to go through that. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, his son. He ruled jointly with his father for a while, then his son. He was good to the Jews. He's the one who commissioned the Septuagint to be written. The Septuagint, if you remember from week 1, that was a long time ago, I know, but if you remember from week 1, the Septuagint was the Hebrew scriptures translated from Hebrew to Greek. He commissioned that. It was wrapped up during Ptolemy XIII's rule, completed during his reign. He perhaps founded, back to Ptolemy II, he perhaps founded the Alexandria Library. He's the one that built the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So what you see here is a kingdom that is growing. When I first got out of college, I started working for a company called Coleman Research. And the founder of that company was just a really smart guy, and he had a whole list of rules that I have. When the company ended up crumbling at some point, I ended up getting a list of his rules, I think hung in the lobby of the building. Through permission, I didn't steal it or anything. But I got these rules, and one of his rules was grow or die. Pretty good rule. They were growing at this point, and they were interested in the state of the state. He also had a lot of other good rules. Every hour spent in the meetings, like 70% wasted. Anybody agree with that? I'm retired now, so I don't have to worry about that too much anymore, except meetings with my wife. Like, oh, did I say that? Just kidding. All right, so he had all these rules, grow or die, and that's what they did in this first part, in the green part, okay? Things started falling apart under Ptolemy IV. He persecuted the Jews. He attempted to enter the Holy of Holies. 3rd Maccabees, one of the Apocrypha, we talked about that in week 1, remember, or week 2. 3rd Maccabees, one of the Apocryphal books, is considered by some to be canonical. Not the Catholics, they don't think so. They consider 12 out of the 18. But the Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox churches consider 3rd Maccabees canonical. And 3rd Maccabees talks about when he tried to enter the Holy of Holies. It's really an interesting story, how God just really whooped up on him. I mean, he really just did. And this made Ptolemy IV so mad that he decided, I'm going to kill all the Jews. I'm going to kill every one of them. And his plan was he's going to gather them all in one place, and he was going to drug these elephants with frankincense and wine, I think, and drug these elephants and let them loose and just trample all the Jews to death. And the story in 3rd Maccabees is really interesting. If you have an Apocrypha at home, go read it. It's really neat. It didn't work out so good for Ptolemy IV. He temporarily defeated Antiochus III the Great in the Battle of Raphia. Very important war. We'll talk about that again next week. That was the Battle of the Tanks. Did you know they had tanks back then? Yeah, they were called elephants. They had tanks back then. Well, one guy's tanks were bigger than the other guy's tanks, and the one guy's tanks were really, really intimidated by the other guy's tanks. We'll talk about that when we get to it. So this is the greatest extent of the Ptolemaic kingdom in 240 BC under the reign of Ptolemy III. They controlled all the way over here to the Carthaginian Empire, not the entire, but much of the north coast, the south coast of the Mediterranean Sea, a lot of the north coast of the Mediterranean Sea, Cyprus, a little piece of Crete, Palestine, of course, pretty good sized kingdom in around 240 BC. All right, 6 Syrian Wars. We're just going to touch on this very briefly. Next week we'll go. And again, where do you put these? They're more germane to the Seleucid side of the story, I think. So I'm going to touch on them. So next week when we start talking about them, say, oh yeah, there were 6 of those. And oh, by the way, 3 were won by the Ptolemies and 3 were won by the Seleucids, and, kind of a little bit of a draw, I guess, really. Why shed all this blood and everything? You're going to end up with basically a draw by the time history is over with. But the first 2 wars, not very exciting. The 3rd war became because of an ex-wife being unhappy with the previous, or the current wife of one of the rulers, one of the Seleucid rulers. That's why we're going to cover it next week. She ended up killing that wife and the son, it didn't work out so well. So the Ptolemies and the Seleucids went to war because of that. The Fourth Syrian War, we have the Battle of Raphia, the Battle of the Tanks that I just mentioned. The Fifth Syrian War, the Syrians ultimately gained control of Palestine during this war in 198 BC. And the Sixth Syrian War, we had the Day of Eleusis. Oh, I hope you come back next week. The Day of Eleusis is pretty cool. A Roman senator or consul, I think he was a consul, drew a line in the sand around Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He says, you have to give up your current plans for annexing Egypt. He said, well, give me some time to think about this. And the guy said, okay, have as long as you want. Just don't step out of that circle until you make your decision. Antiochus Epiphanes was on the very verge of conquering Egypt and making his Seleucid kingdom much greater. I'm going into way too much detail because we're going to cover it next week. But he was going to expand his kingdom so much bigger down all the way through Egypt, and Rome did not like that. They didn't want a strong kingdom. They wanted like little bitty kingdoms that could keep them under control. So this consul drew a line in the sand around Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Step out of that circle. Before you step out of that circle, make a decision. And Antiochus IV Epiphanes said, you know, I'm going to Rome. But he was mad. Do you remember me talking about Antiochus Epiphanes last week? Do you remember me talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes the week before last week? I've mentioned Antiochus Epiphanes many, many times. He was the little horn that sprung up from the four horns. Because of this day in Eleusis, from that line in the sand, he was so mad that he vented his rage on the Jews as he came back through Palestine. And that was the beginning of the badness that was to come, the badness that Antiochus Epiphanes showed the Jews, and then ultimately led to the Maccabean revolt. Now I'm looking forward to that history. That's going to be some fun history. But Antiochus Epiphanes stepped out of the line, and he was basically beholden to Rome. All right, so this is the Middle East in 240 BC. Palestine, Coele-Syria here in the middle, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, as they fought their 6 Syrian Wars. Palestine was always in the crosshairs, and really the whole history of the not Palestinians, but the Seleucids and the Ptolemies is tied up in Palestine. All right, let's continue. The purple, that was first bill. Yeah, first bill. Purple was, remember, the decline, the start of the decline, the transition of the kingdom from a good kingdom in green to kind of this transition of kingdom. Started when with Ptolemy V, actually Ptolemy IV, his father. He's 5 years old when he began to rule. Coele-Syria in 198 BC, in the middle of his reign, passed to the Seleucids during his rule. He was responsible for the Rosetta Stone. Anyone been to the British Museum and seen the Rosetta Stone? That's pretty cool to go and see that in the British Museum. This was written in 3 different languages: Greek, Demotic Egyptian, which is the current script of the day, and then Egyptian hieroglyphics. And it was like the key to unlocking this entire language because of this particular stone here that was commissioned by Ptolemy V. Cleopatra the first Syria, she was a 5A. She ruled as regent for her son Ptolemy VI after the death of Ptolemy V, and most of the queens of Egypt were named after Cleopatra the first. Okay, a Greek, as always, or a Syrian rather. Ptolemy VI Philometor, 2 guardians went to war with Syrians. Bad move on their part. Led to the Day of Eleusis that we just talked about. I got into too much detail there, but we'll talk about it next week. And this was between Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Gaius Popilius Lanus was the one that drew a line in the sand and said, "Step out of that. You got to make your decision before you step out of that." And then we have basically at that point on in red, Egypt was beholden to Rome. Cleopatra II, Ptolemy Eupator, who reigned just for a few months. Ptolemy VII, Neos Philopator. We don't know much about him. There's a lot of disagreement in the literature about who he was. Ptolemy VIII was a bad guy. He persecuted the Jews. He persecuted everybody. He's the one that married his sister and then married his sister's daughter. Okay. So on the wedding day of marrying his sister, he killed her son. Not a nice man. Later on, he also killed another son, their son, Ptolemy Memphis, his son with Cleopatra II. They were at war, and he killed their son and sent his body parts to her while she was holed up in Alexandria. Not a nice man. Interestingly enough, this last bullet, wrap your head around that. They reconciled and later ruled together. How do you do that? How do you do that if he kills your son, if your son from another marriage and also your son with him? How do you do that? How do you end up reconciling and ruling together with this guy? Cleopatra III, the stepdaughter killed by her son. Eventually, Ptolemy X down here killed his mother in 101 BC. And it gets very confusing in the history as we get later on in the Ptolemies. I'm trying to finish this up. Ptolemy XI Alexander ruled jointly with Bernice III for 19 days before killing her. Turns out she was very popular with the people, and they ended up killing him later in a revolt. Yay! Bernice III, Philopator, same one here. We're just breaking them out. She ruled with her father, Ptolemy XI, and then her husband, Uncle Ptolemy X, and her husband's stepson, cousin, Ptolemy XI. Ptolemy XII was best known for almost causing the bankruptcy of the Egyptian Empire. He gave mostly Julius Caesar and Pompey, bribes that were almost the entire gross national product of Egypt as bribes. Wow. That's not too good for the people of Egypt, is it? It's good for it's good for Julius Caesar and Pompey. And because of these bribes, they ended up making him king of Egypt. Now, they didn't like that. The people of Egypt didn't like that, so they declared Bernice IV the king. But he ended up coming back. Ptolemy XII came back and killed his daughter, the Bernice IV, who was ruling. Cleopatra VI, Tryphena, Bernice IV, killed by her father Ptolemy. Ptolemy XIII was the brother of the great Cleopatra. And the second bell is ringing. And I'm going to wrap up this one slide, and we'll pick up Cleopatra next week. Okay? So, Ptolemy XIII was Cleopatra's brother. He messed up. Pompey and Julius Caesar were in civil war. Romans. Roman consul, Julius Caesar, a dictator at that time. They were in a civil war. Okay? Ptolemy was running. He was running everywhere. Julius Caesar's after him all over the place. And Ptolemy ended up running to, Pompey ended up running to Egypt. Ptolemy the 13th killed him. He beheaded him in front of his wife and children. Thinking, that's pretty smart. Because Julius Caesar's the man. I know he's the man, and I'm going to be on Julius Caesar's good side. I'm going to kill his greatest enemy, Pompey. Well, Pompey, turns out that he was a Roman consul. He was also Julius Caesar's son-in-law. So it didn't end well for Ptolemy III. We'll talk about that next week. This is when Cleopatra the Seventh, the famous Cleopatra, used that incident to roll herself up in a rug, we think, there's a story at least, and carried her in, asked for a private audience with Julius Caesar. Oh man, you can say the rest is history. And we'll talk about that next week. See y'all next week. Thank y'all for coming.